1938, Indonesia. The baby who came back 9 times. The Banyuwangi Midwife files. It began as most haunting tales do, with whispers. In the summer of 1938, deep in the humid lowlands of East Java, the small town of Banyuwangi carried a silence that felt too heavy, too deliberate. Houses with bamboo walls stood close together, yet conversations were hushed. Mothers rocked their infants with trembling hands. Fathers stared longer than usual into the dark edges of the rice fields. Something was wrong here, something unspeakable. The first whisper was about a baby who would not stay in the ground. A child born frail, taken too early, mourned by a grieving mother, and buried in the village cemetery beneath a simple wooden marker. But before the family's grief could settle, strange sounds were heard. A soft cry, thin and piercing, echoed through the night air. At first, the villagers told themselves it was only the wind passing through the palm trees. But when the mother swore she heard her baby's cry outside her own door, barefoot on the dirt, the silence of Banyuwangi broke into terror. In small towns, fear spreads faster than disease. One story fuels another. Soon, more families began to murmur of shadows seen by moonlight, of tiny footprints pressed into damp soil where no living child had walked. The whispers wound themselves into the alleys, into the gatherings at the market, into the prayers muttered at dusk. The babies are coming back, they said. 9 times. Every community has its secrets, but in Banyuwangi, secrets lived longer than memory. Some villagers claimed this was not new, that their grandparents once spoke of a curse, one tied to a midwife whose work stretched beyond the natural boundary of life and death. She had been seen at too many cradles, too many graves. She carried a ledger, they said, not of names, but of returns. 9. Always 9. The villagers wanted to believe it was only superstition, yet the evidence lay before them. At night, mothers bolted their doors and placed offerings of rice and incense outside their homes, hoping restless souls would be appeased. Fathers began to keep lanterns burning, their flames swaying in the sticky air, casting long shadows on the walls. But the crying did not stop, and neither did the footprints. Fear took on a shape. People stopped venturing out after sundown. The cemetery became a place no one dared to walk through, even in daylight. Some swore they saw small mounds disturbed. The earth shifted ever so slightly, as though restless from below. 9 times they whispered again. Each child comes back 9 times. And then, like a storm gathering, suspicion turned toward the midwife. She was old, with eyes that glimmered like oil under lamplight. She had delivered nearly every child in Banyuwangi for decades. Her presence lingered in every family story. Some said they saw her late at night near the graves, her hands pressed into the soil as if coaxing something forth. Others swore she was seen walking home with a bundle in her arms, though no infant lived in her house. Still, no one dared accuse her outright. Not yet. To do so meant breaking the fragile fabric that held the village together. To speak her name aloud was to invite her attention, and perhaps the attention of the children who cried at the threshold. By the close of that year, Banyuwangi was no longer an ordinary town. It was a place where silence carried weight, where lantern light trembled against the dark, and where everyone knew the same truth but dared not say it. The babies were returning, and no one understood why. The woman at the center of it all was known only as Ibu Biden, the midwife. She had no family name that anyone used, no husband, no children of her own. She lived in a weathered wooden house at the edge of the village, surrounded by banana trees and creeping vines. Her presence was both ordinary and terrifying. Ordinary because she had helped bring nearly every child in Banyuwangi into the world. Terrifying because her knowledge ran deeper than medicine. Inside her house, it was said, there was a ledger. A heavy book bound in dark cloth, its pages thick and stained from years of use. Some whispered that it was simply a record of births. Others claimed it was something far stranger, a list of names, each one written 9 times in succession, followed by a final mark that resembled not ink, but ash. No villager admitted to seeing the book, yet all believed it existed. The midwife never denied these rumors. She moved through the village like a shadow, neither confirming nor dispelling the fears around her. When mothers begged her for blessings to keep their children safe, she would only smile thinly, the kind of smile that made even daylight feel colder. What gave strength to the rumors were the patterns. The first baby that returned did not come back just once. The mother claimed to have buried him, only to hear his cries 3 nights later. Then again, weeks after that. She swore it happened 9 times before the child finally rested. And when another family lost their infant, the cycle repeated. 9 returns. Always 9. Soon, villagers began to count. With every burial came dread, and with every strange noise in the night came the quiet tally. 1, 2, 3. By the time the 9th return was reached, families no longer wept. They only waited, exhausted and hollow, for the final silence. The midwife kept her distance during these tragedies. She attended the births, sometimes even the funerals, but she was never seen to cry, never seen to pray. Her face remained unreadable, her hands steady. And yet, it was always noticed. She was present in every story, from the first scream of life to the last shovel of soil. One villager, a young father whose child was among the returners, claimed he once followed her. He said he saw her leave her house long after midnight, lantern in hand, walking toward the cemetery. He swore she opened her ledger beneath the moonlight, whispering to the graves as though reading names aloud. When he confronted her, she only placed her hand on his shoulder and said, "You will understand when it is over." He never spoke of it again. The book became more than rumor. It became the village's silent obsession. People wondered whose name might be written there next. They began to fear pregnancy itself, as if new life carried not only hope, but the curse of returning death. Some families begged her to burn the book. Others pleaded for her to reveal its contents, to tell them the truth. She refused. As months turned to years, the ledger became legend. Even the children of the village, too young to know grief, spoke of it in their games. 9 times, they would chant as they played near the rice fields. 9 times before they sleep. What no one could deny was that the midwife carried knowledge that others could not. She knew which children would not stay. She knew which mothers would never rest. And, it seemed, she knew when the 9th return would come. Her ledger remained unseen, yet its shadow grew larger than the village itself. Banyuwangi's people lived in its pages, whether they liked it or not. It began with a boy, a frail child, born in the thick heat of a January night in 1938. His mother, only 17, had labored for 2 days. By the time the midwife wrapped him in cloth, the boy's breathing was shallow, his body small enough to fit in the crook of a single arm. They named him Surya, meaning sun, though he barely survived his first dawn. He lived for 3 weeks. In that short time, his mother grew attached to the faint flutter of life in his chest, the weak cries that woke her at night. But when fever came, burning his tiny body, it ended quickly. Surya's breathing slowed, then stopped. The village dug a shallow grave near the edge of the cemetery, placing him beneath the soil with a wooden marker. The midwife was there, watching, silent as ever. The first night after the burial was uneventful. Only the chirp of crickets, the rustle of palm leaves. But on the second night, his mother woke to a sound. It was faint, almost impossible, yet unmistakable. A cry. Thin, weak, just like before. She ran outside barefoot, the cool earth cutting her soles. And there, near the doorway of her house, she found footprints. Small, perfect, pressed into the damp ground. Her family tried to calm her. Grief, they said, was playing tricks. She agreed for a moment. But when she awoke again the next night to a louder cry, she could not deny it. The sound came from the direction of the cemetery. At dawn, the villagers gathered. Some swore they, too, had heard the cry. Others whispered they saw movement among the graves, the earth trembling as though restless. When the boy's grave was inspected, the soil appeared disturbed, the marker tilted. Fear rippled through the town. The midwife said nothing. She simply stood at the edge of the crowd, her eyes fixed on the mother. The silence was heavier than words. Days later, the boy returned again. A farmer, walking before sunrise, claimed he saw a child crouched at the edge of the rice field, covered in soil, eyes glistening like wet stones. When he approached, the child vanished into mist. The story spread like wildfire. The boy had come back, they said, but he was not alive in the way he once was. The cycle continued. The mother reported dreams where she nursed him, only to wake and find damp soil scattered across her floor. The family's dog refused to enter the house, whining at the threshold as though something unseen lingered inside. And each time the boy's grave was checked, the soil had shifted once more. The villagers began to count. Each return was spoken of in hushed tones. 1, 2, 3. They knew the number. 9. It was always 9. By the 5th return, the mother no longer screamed when she heard him. She simply sat in silence, her hands pressed to her ears, tears falling silently. By the 7th, her body weakened, as though her grief had hollowed her from the inside out. And when the 9th came, there was nothing left in her eyes but emptiness. When the cries finally ceased, the village exhaled. The grave lay still. The soil no longer stirred. But the peace was temporary, for the ledger of returns had opened, and Surya was only the beginning. The first child who would not stay buried became the story no one could unhear. From that moment on, every birth, every fever, every cough was shadowed by the same dreadful question. Would this one come back? Grief is heavy, but in Banyuwangi, it did not rest quietly. It traveled. It seeped through bamboo walls, drifted through the rice fields, and perched at the edges of every dream. What began with one child soon spread, until families across the village whispered of cries that did not belong to the living. The first mother had been pitted. Grief can make people hear things, see things. But when another family swore they heard their dead child's voice calling outside their door, the pity turned to dread. A young couple, their baby taken by fever, began waking in the middle of the night to sounds of scratching at the bamboo walls. The father opened the door once, lantern in hand, and claimed he saw tiny handprints smeared across the wood. The prints vanished by morning, but the terror did not. One by one, families confessed to the same torment. A lullaby sung where no mother sat rocking. The faint sound of an infant coughing in the darkness. Cries that traveled from one house to another, as if the children wandered restlessly between them. The village became sleepless, haunted not by ghosts in white, but by the smallest of sounds, a cry that pierced deeper than any scream. It was always at night, when the air grew heavy and the frogs fell silent. Doors were bolted, windows shuttered, yet the cries slipped through anyway, threading into people's ears until they trembled in their beds. Even the strongest fathers admitted to fear, their hands shaking as they lit extra lanterns to chase away the shadows. Mothers clutched the living children tighter, as if the returned dead might try to take them away. And still, the midwife was there, always present, always silent. Some said she moved from house to house in those nights, her steps quiet on the dirt paths, her shadow stretching long under the moon. It was rumored she carried her ledger with her, stopping at each door where cries were heard, pausing as if marking something down. No one dared open their door when she passed. By the time the third child had returned 9 times, the village began to fracture. Some families wanted to abandon Banyuwangi entirely, to flee before their own children's names appeared in the ledger. Others argued it was impossible. How could they leave the rice fields, the homes of their ancestors, the graves of those who already would not stay buried? Fear chained them to the land, even as the terror spread. The worst came for those who lost infants during this time. To bury a child now was not just grief, it was dread multiplied. They knew what would come. They knew the nights would be long, filled with cries that no prayers could silence. Some mothers began refusing burials altogether, keeping their dead close, swaddled in cloth, hidden beneath their roofs. as if watching over them would keep the returns from happening. It did not. The cries still came. 9. The number echoed through Banyuwangi like a curse. After the 9th return, silence fell, heavy and complete. The families, broken and hollow, would finally find rest. But it was not peace. It was exhaustion, surrender. And the villagers began to notice something more terrifying than the cries themselves. Each return left the families weaker, as if the children's spirits were draining not only their grief, but their very will to live. By the end of 1938, Banyuwangi was a place of hollow eyes and trembling hands. And yet, the cries never stopped, because for every child who finished the 9th return, another was waiting. Another grave would be disturbed. Another family would listen in horror to the sound no parent should ever hear, the cry of a child who should have been at peace. By the time the 4th family endured the cycle, a grim realization spread across Banyuwangi. These were not isolated hauntings. They followed a pattern. Always the same, always precise. 9 nights, or 9 appearances, before the crying ceased forever. And each time, the midwife was there, watching from the shadows, as if she already knew when it would end. The pattern terrified the villagers more than the cries themselves. Grief can be dismissed, accidents explain away, but a pattern carries intent. It means someone was controlling it. The families began keeping count the way a prisoner carves marks into a cell wall. 1, 2, 3. Each return a blow, each cry another weight upon the chest. By the 9th, most families no longer had the strength to weep. They sat hollow-eyed, waiting for silence to fall like an executioner's blade. But what disturbed them most was how precise it was. Never fewer, never more. 9. Even when the burial was rushed, even when offerings were doubled, even when families begged the midwife for help, it never changed. It was as if Banyuwangi itself obeyed rules that no one understood. The villagers began to notice something else. Each return was not identical. The first return often carried sound, the faint cry, the whimper at the window. The second might bring footprints in the soil, small hands leaving trails across the dirt floor. By the 3rd or 4th, shadows began to appear, seen from the corners of eyes, too quick to capture. By the 5th, objects moved, lamps swaying, mats shifting, doors rattling. By the 7th, the families claimed they could see the child, pale, soil-streaked, standing at the threshold, never crossing inside. By the 9th, the child grew weaker, almost transparent, until silence swallowed them whole. It was a ritual in reverse, a burial performed not once but 9 times. And the ledger everyone feared but no one had seen, was believed to record these stages like chapters in a book. Superstition tightened its grip. Families began laying offerings at the cemetery. Rice, flowers, small toys. Some left tiny cups of milk, believing nourishment might calm the restless dead. But the offerings only vanished, never delaying the cycle. If anything, the children seemed to hunger more. The 9th return became the night of release. Villagers would gather near the grieving family, though none dared to enter the house. They waited in silence, holding their breath until the final cry echoed into the night. And then just like that, nothing. The house fell still. The family sat broken, their grief so heavy it seemed to seep into the walls. By now, fear of childbirth ran through Banyuwangi like a sickness. Pregnant mothers dreaded not only labor, but the possibility that their baby might fall into the ledger's grip. Some whispered that the midwife herself was choosing which children would suffer the cycle. Others believed it was punishment for sins no one dared to name. A curse tied to the land, tied to her hands. The midwife never explained. She was always present, silent, as though taking attendance. She knew when the 9th would come. She knew when to stop visiting a family, when her part was finished. And then she would vanish into her house again, ledger clutched tight. The villagers lived in terror of that number. 9 was not simply a count. It was a sentence. It meant suffering stretched out, night after night, until it devoured every scrap of strength a family had. And no one, no prayer, no offering, no plea, had ever broken the pattern. The ninth return was inevitable. And by 1939, everyone in Banyuwangi understood. Once the midwife wrote a name, there was no escape. Fear has a way of creeping beyond walls, beyond doorways, beyond the homes where grief is born. In Banyuwangi, it seeped into the fields, poisoning even the land that fed the village. By 1939, the rice paddies, normally alive with laughter and chatter, had grown unnaturally quiet. Farmers no longer sang as they worked. Women no longer carried baskets with stories on their lips. Every sound, even the splash of water against their legs, seemed to carry an echo they didn't trust. The cries followed them. At first, only at night. But soon, farmers swore they heard them at dawn, faint and distant, carrying across the paddies like wind moving through reeds. One man dropped his sickle when he heard it, convinced the sound came from right behind him. When he turned, nothing stood there, only ripples in the flooded field, as if small feet had disturbed the water. Children, once free to run barefoot through the rows, were now kept indoors. Parents forbade them from playing near the paddies, afraid that the cries might lure them away. Some claimed they saw shapes moving among the stalks, too short to be adults, too quick to be caught. A mother harvesting near dusk said she felt a tug at her skirt, turned, and saw no one. She fainted in the mud, certain it was her own lost child calling to her from the soil. It became impossible to separate superstition from truth. The rice fields, once the heart of Banyuwangi's survival, turned into a place of dread. Farmers began leaving offerings not just at graves, but in the water itself, scattering flowers, pouring small cups of milk into the paddies. They prayed aloud as they worked, their voices trembling, begging the children not to follow them home. The land responded strangely. Crops that year grew in uneven patches, lush in some places, barren in others, as if the soil itself was restless. Harvests came late, stalks bending heavy as though burdened with something unseen. Some villagers whispered that the children were feeding on the fields now, pulling life from the rice, draining the land the way they drained their families. Fear of starvation mixed with fear of the cries. Fathers began taking night watches at the edges of the paddies, lanterns burning, blades in hand. But no blade could cut what they faced. The lights often swayed in the darkness as men swore they saw movement in the water. Shadows darted, ripples spread, but nothing human was ever caught. By morning, the men looked hollow-eyed, worn by terrors they refused to name. Even animals were restless. Water buffalo snorted and thrashed at night, pulling against their ropes as if trying to flee something unseen. Chickens refused to roost quietly, squawking until dawn. Dogs barked into empty spaces, teeth bared, then cowered in silence as though beaten by an invisible hand. The cries became part of the village rhythm. People timed their days by them. Work ended early, homes shuttered before dusk, fields left unfinished if shadows grew too long. Fear was no longer confined to the families who buried their children. It was collective. Everyone carried it. Everyone knew the pattern. And everyone understood that sooner or later, another name would be marked in the ledger. By the end of 1939, Banyuwangi's silence was louder than its cries. No one lingered in the paddies after dark. The field stood like vast mirrors under the moonlight, reflecting a village too afraid to look at itself. And in that silence, every villager wondered the same thing. If the land itself was cursed, how long could they survive living on it? The cries of Banyuwangi's children did not stay hidden for long. Word reached the Regency authorities, men in crisp uniforms, accustomed to logic, to paperwork, to control. They arrived with pens and questions, expecting a simple explanation. Fever, superstition, sleep deprivation, they said it all could be explained. Yet what they found in the village defied every rational report. The midwife was cooperative in the daylight, attending her duties with calm hands and steady eyes. She showed them birth records, tiny scraps of cloth, the usual paraphernalia of her work. But she would not speak of the ledger. She would not explain the repeated returns. The officials left puzzled, then frustrated. One officer called it hysteria. Another dismissed it as coincidence. 9 returns? He scoffed. Impossible. But the villagers had seen it. They described crying at midnight, shadows moving in the rice fields, tiny handprints in dirt and clay. They spoke of fear that weighed on their chests, of mothers weakened beyond grief. Every story seemed more like a warning than a tale. And yet, the authorities refused to act. Some began to suspect the midwife was too powerful, too respected, to challenge openly. She had delivered the children of the village elite, the officials themselves. Accusing her outright could spark backlash, rumor, violence. So they documented the complaints, made polite inquiries, then left. Frustration turned to despair. The villagers realized that the ones who could enforce laws, protect the living, and investigate the unnatural were themselves blind. Blind to cries, blind to soil that moved without wind, blind to children who should have been at peace. And in that blindness, fear grew sharper. Families began taking matters into their own hands. Some stayed awake in shifts, patrolling the houses, the cemeteries, even the rice fields. Lanterns glimmered like fireflies along the paths, casting shadows that only deepened the horror. Others tried to appeal to neighboring towns, hoping outsiders might listen. But tales like theirs were dismissed as superstition, and the midwife's reputation as the village savior protected her from scrutiny. The authorities' refusal to believe gave the village a strange autonomy. If no one official could intervene, then the villagers themselves were left to negotiate with forces they did not understand. They tried to protect their children, but the pattern never changed. Each return marked the inexorable rhythm that outsiders could not perceive, but which every parent endured in silent terror. Even when the 9th return came, and silence fell at last, the families did not feel relief. Instead, there was emptiness and awareness that no one in power could protect them. Every birth after that carried a quiet dread. The authorities would not see. They would not act. And perhaps the village would be left to face the ledger and the midwife alone. By 1940, Banyuwangi existed in 2 parallel realities. By day, it was an ordinary town with officials, markets, and rice fields. By night, it was a place haunted by children who returned from death, by families counting the 9 returns, by a midwife who knew more than anyone dared ask. The silence of disbelief outside the village only made the cries inside sharper, more immediate, impossible to ignore. The authorities may have refused to believe, but the villagers knew the truth. Some things are beyond control, beyond reason, and beyond human intervention. And in Banyuwangi, the ledger's power ruled over all. It was inevitable. Fear, rumor, and desperation eventually demanded a reckoning. By 1941, whispers of the midwife's ledger had reached ears that could no longer ignore them. Families who had endured 9 returns, hollowed and broken, came forward pleading for justice, or at least answers. The village elders, reluctantly persuaded, convened a trial in the open courtyard of Banyuwangi's largest hall. The midwife arrived, calm as always. Her eyes, dark and unreadable, scanned the faces of those who accused her. The villagers had expected anger, tears, maybe confession, but found none. She did not speak, did not plead. The trial proceeded with the usual rituals: witnesses, questioning, accusations. Yet her silence hung over the proceedings heavier than any words. The first to speak were the parents. Mothers, their hands trembling, described cries that had stolen their sleep and their strength. Fathers recounted footprints in mud, shadows at dusk, objects moving without cause. Each tale was more horrifying than the last. Each child, 9 returns, was remembered in detail, the exact nights counted aloud in the courtyard. Then the neighbors spoke. Silent witnesses, those who had seen small shadows slipping between houses, or heard faint whimpers echoing across the rice fields. They could not explain what they saw. They could only testify to the fear that had become the village's constant companion. The midwife, still silent, was called to respond. She lifted her head slowly, and in the hush of the courtyard, finally spoke. Not words of denial, not apology, but a single statement that froze every listener. I do not bring them back. I only mark what returns. A murmur swept through the crowd. What did it mean? Was she claiming the children chose to return? Was it some force beyond her, beyond reason? The villagers could not understand. And that was the terror, that even in her confession, she revealed nothing, only confirmed that the ledger was real and its power undeniable. The trial dragged for hours. Officials questioned the villagers, examined graves, measured footprints, checked birth records. They found nothing that could satisfy logic, nothing that could explain 9 returns. And yet, every witness's fear was genuine. Every parent's grief was real. Every account, identical in detail, proved that something unnatural was at work. The verdict was as strange as the crime. The midwife was neither punished nor absolved. The elders declared her beyond human judgment. She could remain in Banyuwangi, but her ledger would stay sealed. No one was allowed to see it. Her actions were neither condemned nor celebrated. The trial, they decided, was simply a record of events no one could explain. Still, the trial left marks on the village that no law could erase. Families continued to count returns in fear. Children were watched closely, lanterns lit at night, offerings made in secret. Even the silent witnesses, the neighbors who had seen only shadows, carried the weight of what they had witnessed. Banyuwangi had faced its midwife, and yet the ledger remained. The children continued to return, the cries continued to echo, and the village understood something it could never ignore. Some powers are beyond justice, beyond control, and beyond explanation. And in that truth, terror lived on. In Banyuwangi, fear had grown roots deeper than any tree. Families tried everything to stop the returns, from prayers to charms, but it was the rituals that left the deepest mark on the village. The midwife, though silent on most matters, guided some families in secret, teaching them ceremonies whispered only in the dead of night. The most common ritual involved the grave itself. Families were instructed to place rice, small toys, and pieces of cloth atop the earth, to circle it 3 times before leaving, and to whisper the child's name 9 times. Some did it faithfully. Some performed the ritual only partially, either out of disbelief or exhaustion. Every family reported the same result. Partial rituals did not prevent the returns. Only when each step was completed to perfection did the final silence of the 9th return come. Superstitions became law in the homes of Banyuwangi. Pregnant women were forbidden to leave the house after sunset. Children born in the middle of the night were bathed in water mixed with herbs believed to repel restless spirits. Even mundane acts, sweeping floors, washing clothes, cooking rice, were done with careful attention to avoid disturbing the dead. A misstep might invite a return. Forbidden burials became a desperate solution for some. Mothers, terrified of watching their child return, tried burying infants in hidden corners of the village, behind granaries, beneath old trees, in the shallow soil near rivers. These acts only deepened the curse. Every hidden grave was eventually discovered, either by the villagers or the child themselves, as the returns continued. The ledger seemed to track all graves, no matter how concealed, no matter how secret. Villagers whispered that the midwife's ledger was not just a book, it was a contract. Every birth, every death, every return was recorded, marked, and sealed. Some families theorized that the midwife's rituals were a way to negotiate with the ledger itself, to appease it so the returns would end after 9. Others thought she controlled the ledger, but only partially, bound by rules none could understand. Despite fear, life went on. People continued to marry, to give birth, to live. But every new life carried a shadow. Each household learned to count, to observe, to prepare for the inevitable. Lanterns stayed lit later into the night. Windows were tightly shut. Even the wind that rustled through the rice fields became suspect, carrying with it the potential for a child's return. It was in these rituals that Banyuwangi discovered both hope and despair. Proper ceremonies could end the cycle of 9 returns, but missteps, however small, could prolong it or invite it anew. The midwife's presence became essential, her guidance the only way to navigate the fragile line between life and the unnatural. The villagers lived in constant negotiation with death and return, caught between superstition and survival. Every ritual, every superstition, every forbidden burial was a testament to fear and devotion intertwined. Families learned that life in Banyuwangi was never just about living. It was about keeping the children, whether alive or dead, at peace. And yet, even with rituals performed perfectly, the villagers never forgot the ledger, never forgot the returns, never forgot the cries that had changed their lives forever. Time passed, but the shadows of 1938 never left Banyuwangi. Even decades later, the villagers spoke in hushed tones of the babies who returned 9 times. Children born after that year were watched with vigilance, and every death, no matter how natural, was measured against the ledger's cruel rhythm. The stories of those who lived through it were passed down like warnings, etched into the collective memory of the town. Some families left entirely, seeking safety in distant towns, but they carried the fear with them. They whispered to their children of unseen forces, of numbers and rituals, of a midwife whose ledger marked lives beyond mortal comprehension. Even away from Banyuwangi, the cries were remembered, echoes of a terror that could not be buried, that could not be silenced. The midwife eventually aged, her hair silver, her hands slower. She continued to deliver children, still present at every birth, still marking in the ledger. But in her absence from the fields, the villagers realized that her knowledge and authority had been a tether to the unnatural. Without her guidance, fear grew heavier, rituals became fragmented, and every return became more uncertain. Yet, for all the horror, there was a strange resilience. Families endured. Mothers who had sat awake, counting the 9 returns, found ways to sleep again, their bodies recovering even as their hearts remained vigilant. Fathers learned to patrol the fields less, trusting the cycles, trusting the rituals, trusting the ledger in ways they never could explain. Children grew up, playing in the same rice paddies that had once seemed cursed, laughing where their parents had once trembled. The village itself carried the legacy. Every path, every cemetery, every field became a reminder that life and death were intertwined, that every birth carried both hope and dread. The stories were taught to the young, not as folklore, but as lessons: how to respect life, how to honor the dead, and how to live cautiously in a world that sometimes defies explanation. Historians who later studied Banyuwangi were puzzled. Official records noted births, deaths, and mysterious disappearances, but the ledger itself remained unseen, an invisible spine to the events that had shaped the town. Anthropologists recorded rituals, offerings, and the lingering fear that permeated the culture. But the emotional depth, the grief, the terror, the hollow nights filled with cries, was something no record could capture. And so the story endured, carried in memory rather than ink. The children who returned 9 times became symbols of a village's endurance, a midwife's mysterious power, and the fragile balance between life, death, and the inexplicable. Families learned that survival was not just about living day to day. It was about honoring the cycle, performing the rituals, respecting the ledger, and, above all, listening to the children who could not stay buried. By the time the midwife passed, the ledger disappeared with her. But the legacy remained. Banyuwangi had been forever changed, its people marked by fear, resilience, and the haunting knowledge that some things cannot be explained, only survived. And every time a child cried at night, the villagers remembered, the world is larger, stranger, and darker than it seems. The babies may have returned 9 times, but their story, and the story of Banyuwangi, would return in memory 1,000 more.